Pharisees, the teachers of the law and the people who write the law and interpret it for the people. Okay? It's kind of strange to think of it that way because we don't think of our whole life as being defined by sort of the church. But at this time, it was, I don't want to say it was all one because their politics and their religion were as far apart as they could be. You had Rome ruling the country and you had the Jewish laws, customs of the people. But there was a need for this kind of a thing because there was a lot more, we would say nowadays, people are more educated. We're able to read our own Bible and find answers, so we don't always need someone to tell us a right answer, right? It helps to know somebody if it's hard, but we can read it ourselves. Back then, most people couldn't even get to one to read, whether they could read or not. So here we are, the blind guides, the scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind. For which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind. For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it, and all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. All right. So following this argument, you already can kind of tell that part of the problem that he's having right here with the scribes and the Pharisees is that they have made distinctions, somehow religious distinctions, that allowed you to make an oath and not have to keep it. Or you made an oath and you had to keep it. And just on the surface, it also seems arbitrary, right? So this is unfair. This is one of the things that Jesus is talking about that the Pharisees would do to people, is they would make the rules hard to keep and then enforce them viciously, basically making sure no one was as holy as they were, right? And so that's not obviously a Christian mindset, right? We're not trying to create rules that no one can keep. But it goes a little deeper than that too, because what's actually going on is they're saying, if you swear by the altar, no big deal. But if you say the gold of the altar, which I guess is, a beautiful part of the altar, oh, that matters. Jesus is saying, wait a minute. The deeper thing is the deeper thing here. The altar makes the gold holy. The gold doesn't make the altar holy. Right? So what's happening here is also the transformation of what we call spiritual reality, and then saying that the physical, this worldly reality is the more important one. It's the altar of God. The gold on the altar is what makes something holy. So Jesus is having to roll this back. The temple sanctifies the gold, therefore the temple is superior. But all of it is holy and of great importance. That's the other thing we need to notice. Jesus isn't saying the opposite either. He's not saying, well, then if you swear by the altar, you need to keep it. But if you swear by the gold on the altar, you don't need to keep it. He doesn't say that either. What he's actually saying is when you take an oath on anything referring to God, it's an oath. That's what he's saying. Does that make sense? In other words, don't play around fast and loose with spiritual things. Do what you say you're going to do. That's what's important. Not what you swore by. Well, I only swore on, an ant's life, not my child's life. I would say, well, why are you swearing at all? And if you swear, keep it. What's that?
Your word's supposed to be good.
Exactly. And of course, in the famously in Matthew 5:34-37, in the Sermon on the Mount, we heard him say it, do not swear at all. And he says, by heaven or by earth. Because in actual fact, our word should be our bond, and we should not bring other things to bear into that thing. That doesn't mean we don't swear an oath at like a court. It's not talking about like, John, did you take out the garbage today? And he's like, I swear. Right? It's like, no, just yes or no. Yeah. It's just your word should be your word. yes be yes, no be no. What is more than these is from the evil one.
So his thought about making the distinction about swearing, don't do it at all.
Yeah.
And the fact that perhaps we as humans, if we're saying, well, I swore against the gold versus I swore against the altar, maybe that's our human tendency to always try to superanalyze, break things apart, justify.
Justify,
Right.
especially justify. And we do that all the time. Well, Father, I lied. Oh, well, you know, and I'm just hearing a confession, no big deal. But it's not that big of a deal. We don't need to bring that to confession. You brought it to confession because it was a big deal in your life. Just leave it there. If it's a big lie, it's a small lie. You feel guilty, leave it there. We don't have to make excuses. Well, I only lied about money I took from my wife. It's not a big deal. Right? But isn't that how we do it? Like anything we do is a really small thing, and then whatever they do, it's a really big thing. But my wife put my shoes in the wrong closet, you know. So it's like, yeah, maybe stealing from your wife is the problem. Yeah. So yes, but isn't that so typical? Isn't that what we always want to do? Well, it wasn't really bad. It wasn't really that bad. I just did. I sinned against my neighbor. I didn't sin against God or anything. And God would say, no, actually, that's right. 2 great commandments. So, yeah, so many sins in our life are due to this. So, for instance, we can treat people badly because they supposedly treated us badly or they treated someone we love badly. But they're the image of God. It turns out they're a holy thing. They're a holy object, and yet we don't seem to think anything bad about running them down. Right? Well, no, it's kind of a big deal. We may treat someone better if they have a title, but both that person and the poor person are the image of God. Right? Yeah, so, you know, when we see a bishop and we treat a bishop in a certain way because they're a bishop, that should kind of give us this idea of like, oh, well, if I treat some dignitary this way, do I treat the poor with dignity? I mean, we're not going to set them up on a podium. They're not representing something in particular, but we should treat them as good as we would treat the bishop, right? Make sure they have water, make sure they have what they need, food, right? They're visiting our church and they're destitute. We might set them up a table and give them some food, right? Like we would a bishop. Because we don't look at individual people and titles as higher than another. This is a way that we do this, right? We make some outward effect far more important than the holy thing that's in every object, actually, right? It really doesn't matter what you pick, does it? It's like God, you know, a blade of grass. Well, God made it. Well, you'll probably take care of the grass. People who take good care of their lawns, that's a good act. It's a holy act of maintaining the beauty of God's creation or whatever else. We could take this to like everything, you know. All right. So let's go on to the next woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone, blind guides, who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. And that one goes with the last one too, right? The idea of straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. You can tell how that's related to the one right before it. Okay, so...
Is it a real camel this time?
It's a real camel this time, yeah. Because he's talking about animals in this case. Okay, so this passage is very clear. Jesus does not condemn the tithe. I just have to start by saying this. People say, I hear many people say, Father, we don't have to tithe anymore. We don't have to give 10% of our blessings to God. That is not what Jesus says here. He actually says you are supposed to tithe. I don't know if you noticed, but it says, you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, yes, right? But notice what he says. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. In other words, he doesn't condemn the fact that they were taking 10% of the stuff they were growing in their garden and giving it to the temple. That was actually a good thing. What he's condemning is that then they're not doing the actually important things like justice and mercy and love. Right? Like, boy, you guys get down to it when it's your spice rack. But then when it's like actually being kind to a destitute widow, you guys are just telling her to pack it. That's what he's getting mad about. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. So we just have to be very clear because it's just not true. The Bible teaches the tithe in the Old Testament, and the Bible teaches the tithe in the New Testament. That's just a fact. And I know it's upsetting. You know, we talk about money in the church, and people don't like to talk about it, but Jesus talks about money a lot, and money has a huge spiritual meaning behind it, because money and how we use it really is, especially in the modern day, because we use money for everything, and back then they did use money for everything. We do use money for everything. It is a direct indicator of where our heart is, where we put our money. It's a direct reflection of who we are, right? Most of us know that. Like, if we spend stuff on our house, it's because that stuff expresses the things that we like and the things that we think are important. Does that make sense? Your decorations in your house. It's usually purposeful. But so is every other way we use money, right? Yeah. If you found out that a person used most of their money on food, it might be an indicator that they really like food. I mean, you would say that. It's an indicator they really like food. Not saying whether that's a sin or not. That's neither here nor there. Just saying how we spend our money is a nice indicator of what we think is important in our lives. Or maybe we don't have any discipline. That's the other possibility. No reflection, just we have no discipline. But if we have any discipline at all, how we use our money is a show of what is important to our soul. This is what Jesus teaches us. That's why giving money to the poor, giving money to the church is a real indicator of a healthy soul, is because what it shows is that that's what the person thinks is important with their money and their time. Money, of course, represents time. Time represents what we do with our life, right? So, but Jesus is very clear. I do want to say that before we go any further. He does say, this you should have done, even to tithing mint, dill, and cumin. Like, because if we don't hear this, we're not going to hear it. Like, he's like, I really mean it. Like, down to the details. You were right about that. Then we've got to hear. But you can't neglect justice, mercy, and faith. All right. Now, what's interesting here, too, is this is a direct parallel with one of the great passages in the Old Testament. My kids all had this memorized when they were really little. Micah 6:8. He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you?
I justly love mercy and walk humbly with God.
That is the whole of the Christian life right there, Micah 6:8. Okay, Micah 6:8. Old Testament.
And what does he require? Well,
Yep.
Say it louder.
1000, page 1008.
No, I want their answers louder.
Yeah, go ahead. Say your answer louder.
I justly love mercy and walk humbly.
Walk humbly with your God. That's Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O man, what is good, or what does the Lord seek from you, but to do justly and to love mercy and to be ready to walk with the Lord your God. It's a different translation, same deal. Page 1008 on the right near the bottom, 6:8. This is a good passage to always keep in mind, because this is the whole thing. This is the whole thing. Why were we put here? What is my life for? Father, I don't know what I'm doing. What am I supposed to do? Act justly. Love mercy. And it says, be ready to walk with your God, or walk humbly. Be ready. In other words, like, be attentive like a servant. Be humble. Ready to do what the Lord wants me to do. A lot of times we make our life way too complicated. It's that simple. What am I supposed to do today, Father? I don't know. You got to go get the groceries. You got to go take the garbage out. You got to go do that. Do that and act justly. Love mercy. If you've gone your way to take the grocery out and somebody's in need or an animal's hurt, or you know what you're supposed to do, you make room for mercy. Make room for mercy. And then walk humbly with your God. Be ready to do God's word when it becomes apparent what that is for the day. So a lot of the things we think are important about our lives are actually the less important thing. Not that they're not important, because we already saw from Jesus. Jesus doesn't say it's unimportant. The gold and the altar, they're both holy. So we're not saying that our life doesn't matter. But what we are saying is like our job is the platform on which we execute our life. Acting justly in our job. Loving mercy through our job. Walking humbly with God in our job. You see? It's the like the stage on which the real life is taking place. Which is these three things. And Jesus' parallel to them is exactly this. So they know, they're scribes and Pharisees. They know this Bible verse. And that's actually what he's condemning, by the way, in Micah. He's condemning the fact that they were doing all these sacrifices really, really to the letter, and then they weren't taking care of the poor or the widow or whatever else. Okay? So the reason why we want to make sure that we understand that his statement about the tithe, he expects people to tithe. The reason that's important is we're not seeing here Jesus say, these small things are unimportant because this big thing's important. It's the idea that these big things are important and so the little things matter. That's the point. That's the point. Does that make sense? You're not loving mercy if you're not giving a tithe. You don't love mercy. You love money. So you won't give a tithe. You won't give it up. You won't let go of it. Same idea. You're not acting justly. Why? Because God's law says to tithe. And you're not doing it. But it's not the tithe that's the point. It's the justice, the mercy, the faith. See, these things inform those little things. But we don't throw either one out. However, Father, I fast. I only eat greens on Wednesdays and Fridays. Well, great. But were you merciful to your neighbor? Or were you like a super grump because all you do is eat greens? You know what I'm saying? So good. A priest would say, good. I'm glad to hear your fasting life is going well. Bigger issue, though, for you.
So it's actually like a hierarchy or a pyramid, and it reminds me a little bit of Maslow's, where everything builds up.
Yes. That's it. That's right. And if we can keep that clear, see, the problem is we don't usually keep that hierarchy clear. Might have to ask you to get me some water.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you.
I don't have anything.
Sorry about that. My throat's getting scratchy. Yes, it is a hierarchy, but the tendency for all of us is to negate one or the other, right? Sort of Plato and Aristotle. Right? It's like either we love the high ideas and we forget to actually live, or we live and we think the things that are near us are what matter, and we don't think about the higher things. And Jesus is saying, no, it's about keeping the higher things in mind while you do the little thing. Right? To me, this is like the epitome too of beautiful faith in the church. This is the person who vacuums the floor at church. That is a beautiful act of love. When I hear it, it just warms my heart because it's like a lowly act that is so high in faith. The faith quotient of it is so high because it's investing in God through this very small detail. What's that?
And cleaning the kitchen too.
Cleaning the kitchen, a really good example. Totally thankless job. Another one that priests get to see is the person who goes through and scrapes the wax off the floor of the altar. Totally a thankless job, but it has to be done, and it is just that's the way we think as Christians. It's doing that attentively. So that's what I mean by we don't reject the tithe. We don't want to look at this passage and think he doesn't like tithing. He just wants justice, love, and mercy. Right? No, he's saying when you these big things are the goal in your life, these little things order themselves. But if these little things aren't ordered, it could be an indicator that the top thing's not done. But don't just order the little things and think you've done the big things. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? That's the biggest danger. That's what the Pharisees are doing. They're scraping the altar floors, right? Hoping to find a gold coin buried somewhere. Right? They're doing it, but not for the purpose of serving God, loving their neighbor, this sort of thing. higher principles. Another really good example, and this is, we see this in Jesus' life. There's an extraordinary miracle to me in the life of Christ, that he always has time for a person. Have you ever noticed that? Almost all of our Sunday gospel readings, he's interrupted. He's on his way somewhere. It'll say, on his way into Jericho, a man. Or, right, a woman as he's passing through grabbed the hem of his garment. And then Jesus turns around and takes the time to find her. Right? Because he's never interrupted. And why is that? Because he acts justly, but in this case, loves mercy. If we love mercy, there is no thing that could throw us off our rhythm for the day. Because we're looking for the person to interrupt our time. How can I help the person near me that needs me? Whatever that might look like. See what I mean? When we get these things together, it's not one or the other. It's when we get these things together that we've really got something going. But Jesus does make very clear one is much higher than the other. Justice, mercy, and faith are greater. But they're greater because they would lead to the lesser. Okay. All right. So, we can move on. So he continues to go on. Verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them might be clean also. Okay, so he's taking, he kind of mixes metaphors here, which is interesting. If you're a writer, you might have, or a reader, you might have caught the mixed metaphor. So he starts by saying, why do you clean the dish and it's full of extortion? I've never met a dish that had extortion in it. So he's mixing his metaphors, right? Making clear that he's telling us a parable. So he's saying you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish. So we all know this. This is like I've got a cup and I polish the outside of it and put it back on the table. Well, what does that do?
Makes the outside look nice.
Yeah, but the inside is
Still soiled and.
yeah, and you're going to serve water in it? That's gross. We would all say that's gross. But do we do that in our spiritual life? So do we polish the outside? We look good at church. We go to the right meetings. We maybe do whatever it is to get on that list of the people who donated thus and such to this and that. But we don't cleanse the inside of the cup. We're not actually dealing with our own life in sin and our own life of the passions and our own life of being just and merciful and faithful. That's what he's getting at. Mm-hmm. So he's saying, yeah, I mean, you guys, you all look the part. You got your big beards and you didn't even trim the edges because Leviticus said that one time, and you've got long strings hanging off your stuff, but you're extortioners. Yeah, so he's really critiquing the fact that they look the part, but they aren't being the part. And I already talked about this last week, but I always condemn myself when I read these things. I, as a priest, have to be this way. I can't put on gold clothes on Sunday and not be trying to cleanse the inside of that heart. I have to be repentant in order to do the job of a priest. And likewise, all of us as Christians, that's what we're doing. We're not hypocrites. We don't say we're perfect. I sin. I make mistakes, right? And God forbid, but I'll keep making them. But hopefully, I keep cleaning the inside of the cup, right? But the Pharisees are kind of doing the opposite. They're not doing the inward work, and so there are these religious people, and he already exposed them. Remember back in the last chapter, showing that they don't care about religious things because they couldn't answer the question about John. Right? They knew the right answer. Where was John from? They wouldn't say it because they knew that meant they'd lose the argument. So they love winning an argument more than the truth. So Jesus has already exposed them as posers, as like politicians, more than religious people. Right. So all of these woes are coming off of, and we should acknowledge that too. I don't think I've said that explicitly. These woes are coming off of that fact. He's exposed to themselves that they're hypocrites. They know they failed to answer that question, and they know why. They knew the answer. They didn't want to lose the argument. And so he's already exposed them as hypocrites. So as we hear him say, you hypocrites, we shouldn't be, you hypocrites! He's not yelling and screaming. He's saying, your hypocrisy keeps going deeper. Like if you just got that I exposed you as a hypocrite, look harder. because it's a mess. He's trying to humble them, like get them off that pedestal. See, if they get off that pedestal, they'll join him at the cross. If they do not get off the pedestal, they're going to crucify him. So one or the other is going to happen here. I mean, kind of literally. Because we are days away from the crucifixion. This is Holy Week. Okay, so he is trying to win over anybody he can win over. Yeah.
Father, you might have mentioned this at one time, but the Sadducees, do you feel they're better at cleaning the inside than being concerned about the outside versus
No.
the Pharisees?
No, I think I think from the viewpoint of the people of this time, the Sadducees were just bad at all of it. They were just corrupt. All right. The Pharisees appear not to be, and he's showing that they actually are. Okay, but the Sadducees, I mean, everybody was like, well, the priests are all a bunch of no good so-and-sos, but we have to go do our sacrifices.
Okay.
That was kind of a big issue in the first century. The priests were very, very much not respected. Okay, so verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. It's doubling down on what we just heard. They're painted tombs. It's a great, great analogy, though. It's a great analogy. I mean, obviously it's the Lord, so of course it's great. But like, it's great because it gets to the point. We are dead inside without Christ. Like, we're not sick inside without Christ. We're dead. There's no life inside. And that if we don't fill our hearts with Christ, if we don't make him the center of our life and the goal of our existence, then we will continue to kind of operate sort of short-circuiting all over the place. Right? They're whitewashed tombs. They're full of dead men's bones, but they look great. Right? Yeah. And this is, again, it's hard for me to read.
It is, doesn't he?
What's that?
He tells it like it is.
Yeah, and he's taking this opportunity to tell them the truth. Up to this point, he's entered into their debates, but now he's won the debate, and he's trying to pry open their hard hearts to try to get any light in it all. And as we said, it does actually end up working, because many Pharisees did become Christians after the resurrection, but this is a hard thing to hear, and it's a scary thing. It is worth mentioning, though, just to come back to this, that we as Orthodox Christians, one of the things that's important to us is we can't change the outward aspects of our life and think that we've done anything to the inward. Now, I'm not saying, like, sometimes that'll happen, like we'll dress more modestly because we're taking modesty more seriously. But one of the things that I don't know, I think it happens a lot. But like, a guy starts to take his faith seriously, so he starts growing out a big long beard to look like the saints and icons. That's not going to make you a saint. Looking like Saint Basil isn't being Saint Basil, and Saint Basil would be Saint Basil without the long beard, right? Chop his beard off, he's still Saint Basil. Right? So we as Orthodox, it isn't about the clothes we wear, it isn't about the shoes, it isn't about the cars we drive or don't drive. Nothing we do in that regard is an indicator of the spiritual life, right? You can drive a nice car and be horrible. We could drive a nice car and be one of the most philanthropic people alive, and we know those people too, right? So every now and then they come around. Doesn't happen often, but it happens, right? Some of the great philanthropists were just stinking rich, right? But we have, libraries because of them. And I mean, this town's a great example. There's so much great philanthropy from people who've been well off in the community throughout the history of Toledo. It's one of the first things I noticed here. It's a beautiful town in that regard. It still exists, this idea that, you can be well off and like actually help your neighbor. Like, make a nice park. Thank you. Like, they actually did what you were supposed to do with your money instead of hoard it. So, all right. So, any questions? I mean, we've kind of killed this, but he's going to do it one more time here. One more big one. All right, let's do the next big one. Also worth mentioning, you do notice being kind and gentle does not always mean being nice. Maybe we should mention that at this point. I don't think anybody would say after reading this, Jesus is being really nice right now. He's not being really nice. He's being kind because he's exposing their problems. He's being gentle. He's not screaming at them. He's not being unreasonable. He's also, by the way, he's not talking to the people about them. He's talking to them about them. And that's gentle and kind. He's not being nice. And sometimes there has to be a line there where we say, try to be nice. I try to be nice when I can. But sometimes clarity is kindness. Okay? We have to do it in a good way. If we can't do it in a good way, we shouldn't do it at all. Okay? And by the way, that is the default to the saints. Many of the times they say we shouldn't correct people at all because we can't do it in a good way. Most of us can't. That's okay too. So we're not saying that, okay? But we are saying sometimes being holy doesn't mean being nice. It means being kind, gentle, but clear. And that might be not so great. But or I may not feel so great. But it has to happen because the person can't correct, or you could end up with a problem. You could end up people getting hurt if you're not clear, right? Yeah, especially like in business, in the business world, if air traffic controller isn't clear, people die. Okay, but he should be clear and gentle, right? Not screaming will not help either, right? The same in our own lives. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. All right, so Abel was killed by Cain because of their offering that they made. You remember that? Right? The other one that's mentioned is also a priest. I say also a priest because Abel was offering something to God like a priest, as a priest. And now we have Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom is between the temple and the altar, which would have meant he had to be a priest because he was doing his temple duty and they murdered him. The church fathers seem to indicate this is John the Baptist's father, Zechariah. Baruch, his father, is a son of Berechiah. That's the name Baruch in Hebrew, was a common name. There was an Old Testament prophet named Zechariah, son of Berechiah, but he didn't die in this way. And so there's always been a question of, like, is Jesus wrong? And of course, Jesus is not wrong. But it is well known in the church history that Zechariah, John's dad, was murdered doing his temple service. And he was murdered specifically because, if you remember, Elizabeth had to take John and run in order for Herod not to kill him. Remember that with the babies? Mm-hmm. So Elizabeth ran, and he claimed he didn't know where they were, which actually was true. He didn't know where they were. They just fled blindly into the desert to one of the outlying communities. So he had no idea where they landed, but because he had his temple duty. But what this also shows is Zechariah was a good priest. He felt the need to do his duty to God because he was an ordained priest, even though the whole system was virtually corrupt. But he did it out of faith because God required it of him. So he basically goes knowingly to his death. He knows, right? Anybody else could have run and hid during this time. Zechariah can't because he has to serve. Okay. Also an interesting parallel because throughout the history of the church, the bishops and the priests are the first to be martyred because they're the ones who can't leave their posts. They actually can't leave town. Right? But anyway, this is John the Baptist's dad by all, well, not by all, but by most of the patristic accounts I could find. So he says that, so they're sitting, so now that gives you a little sense of what he means. He says, So you build monuments to the prophets, and you say, oh, if I were back then, I wouldn't persecute the prophets like our great-grandfathers did. And they literally plotted to murder, and did murder, a priest in the temple complex while he was serving. They hypocrites. And this may have come, I've always felt this way with this passage. They may be shocked that he knows that. Because they certainly would have hid it, but he just exposed it. I'm fully aware of what you're up to. Because they always say, oh, who's trying to kill you, Jesus? Like, come on. I know what you're up to. Don't do that. You hypocrites. Right? So that's what's going on. Oh, we wouldn't kill the prophets. Oh, no, but you killed Zechariah the son of Berechiah in between the altar and the temple. Like your fathers would have never done something that evil. Well, they would have, but it's kind of a comparison. You get it? They did do something that evil, but anyways. All right, so he says, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? And then he says, I send you prophets, wise men, scribes. He's going to send them the apostles. He's going to send them other Christians, and they're going to persecute them and kill them. And so he says, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. The blood of Abel to Zechariah, which great in English, it's A to Z. It's English, not any of these languages, but A to Z. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Here's how we know Jesus isn't yelling at them. Let's listen to how he ends this conversation. The one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then verse 24, chapter 24, verse 1 on the next page. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. Now this is a really profound moment. Because if you remember in the Old Testament, when they rebuilt the temple after Solomon's temple was destroyed, they rebuilt it in the books Ezra and Nehemiah, right? They rebuilt the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And unlike the first time, God never reappears in the form of like a cloud or fire or anything like he did in Solomon's time. And so there was still a sense that something had to happen and that God would return to his temple. That they were like in the end times, you would say, and they're expecting God's going to show up and he's going to take up residence again in his temple like he did. We're just not doing something right. And part of the reason the Pharisees are so adamant about all these rules is because they believed that they needed to keep the rules better. If they had become a pure nation, God would reappear. But what they didn't realize was that was what was happening right then. God was standing in the temple complex. God had returned to the temple. And they rejected it. So when he says this, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. In other words, for ages I've wanted to gather you together, and I came, and I'm ready. You won't. You won't come. We can look now back at the whole Gospel of Matthew at this point. Is there anything Jesus left undone? Did he not show them enough miracles? Did he not teach them truths? Were his truths unclear? Did they seem evil? Never. Did anything he say not come from the Old Testament? He was clear. He taught. He worked miracles. He healed anyone who needed it. Now he comes up against the Pharisees and he just comes directly. He reduces their arguments to dust, tells them they've got to get their act together. They won't. And so what happens? He departs. God leaves the temple. And this will be the last time. This will be the last time. 2-hour day. For 2,000 years, there's not been a rebuilt temple. Julian the Apostate attempted to and never could complete it. All right. So, Your house is left to you desolate. I'm out. We're done. Right? And he says, you will see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What day is that? Palm Sunday, yeah. Which is actually, we're not too far away. Here we go. Chapter 24. This is the end times passage in Matthew. And it's always made into a very big deal. We're going to kind of break down. We need to break it down in order to understand it. So here we go. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, and will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. All right. So let's back up and try to understand that this is a very famous passage. Many of us can quote it on accident, right? Wars and rumors of wars, for instance. You know, it's a common phrase even in popular stuff. This main portion that I just read right now was fulfilled in the year 70 AD, about 40 years from this moment. And that is when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. Okay? It's important to stop here and recognize the discussion. Jesus isn't talking about the end of all creation, the end of the Jewish nation. This is a kind of end of time. We might say the end of an era, might be the way we would say it. Okay? But these cataclysmic events in the Bible always have an end times language associated with it. And the reason for that is because, remember we talked about this at the very beginning of our Matthew Bible study. Prophecies always have an immediate and a long-term effect, right? Jesus is speaking here of a very immediate effect. They specifically said, you heard them say it, look at these stones, Jesus. Aren't these buildings amazing? And Jesus says, not one stone will be left on another. That happens in 70 AD. There's not another temple in Jerusalem to destroy. So it can't be, at least not any future we're living in. Maybe they'll rebuild it down the road, but there doesn't seem to be any indication that they're going to get that project done, right? Okay, so it's not just an end times reference here. So then, let's look at the questions he's answering, because it really, really helps. St. John Chrysostom is the one that points this out. Tell us, so here's the questions. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? In other words, they're even seem to acknowledge the question as two separate questions. When will what you just said happen? And then what will be the sign of the end? And maybe they're conflating the two because they don't know. But there's definitely two questions. And Jesus answers them as separate questions. And we're going to watch the dialogue shift, okay, when he gets to the end times, okay, he'll get there. So this next part that we just read is not about our end times. It's about their end times. The end of that era. The end of, we would say, the whole Old Testament structure coming down, okay? You could say it that way. So first, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah. This happened. Right before and right after Jesus, there were many false messiahs. And so this is what partially makes Jesus' claim to be the Messiah more problematic for the Pharisees, is they had not long before had this problem and almost got into big trouble. And afterwards, they're going to have a much worse one, attempt at calling themselves a Messiah. Because this time in Israel, they knew they were living at a really crucial time in history. They just kind of missed the crucial part. Crucial, the play on the word there is crucial comes from the word cross. So they missed Christ. So they had many false messiahs at this time. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. In other words, wars and rumors of wars are not the sign of the end. That's going to happen. And also, it's just important because every single time in my own lifetime that we have a war, especially if it's in the Middle East, which has been pretty much my whole lifetime, we said it was the end times. Jesus clearly says, no, wars and rumors of wars happen, and it is not a sign of the end times. With me? That's what he says. See to it you're not alarmed. These things must happen, but the end is still to come. It's not a sign. It just happens. It's the way life goes. Wars happen. Okay? Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. This is not even the end. In other words, it's not going to be earthquakes and fires and floods and pestilences that are going to tell us, oh, we're close to the end. That's the birth pains. And that's happening then. So just remember, this has been going on for 2,000 years. It might go on for another 2,000 years. But we as Christians do not get worried when wars and rumors of wars occur, when there's famines and earthquakes and pestilences. What do Christians do when there's famines, earthquakes, and pestilences? We usually go into them. We help the people who are suffering. We don't assume the whole end times has come and we're just going to bail. Right? I mean, I hate to say it, but modern end times movements have done that. There will be earthquakes and famines and pestilences, and they bail. Well, that's not what we've ever done in history, because we know from what Jesus just said, that's not the end times. That's the beginning of birth pains. That's like when my wife starts having first contractions, we don't even get up off the couch. I'm sorry, 5 kids at home, but that's the way it is. It's like, yeah, we'll see.
It's the beginning, yeah.
It's the beginning. We'll see. You know?
It's a long road.
Yeah, it's a long road. So, I mean, it matters, but, we got a ways to go. So we should watch the Cubs game. These girls know. All right.
Be prepared. That's all we can say is be prepared.
Yeah, exactly.
So why do so many feel the opposite of what we're just talking about? That these are in fact they're imminent. And you have a lot of people out there that are saying, hey, I've even heard of people that say the end date is October 15th.
Oh yeah.
Why are so many people doing that? Is it for a claim, or just they think they know better, versus saying, but wait a minute, it isn't really the end?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been the case in American history for a long time. We're a very end times oriented people from the very beginning. I mean, actually, the Pilgrims landed here partially because of their belief in the end times. So I think part of it is just deep in our psyche as Americans.
Trying to control things, perhaps? Or?
Yeah, and I think everybody wants to uncover some new secret hidden thing in the Bible. And that just brings us back to the woes, because a lot of times we do this. We get so involved in the stuff we can't understand, we don't do the stuff we can understand. And I think that's just typical of us. It's like, well, the stuff Jesus said in the last chapter is really hard. So what if we just, we simplify it and we're like, oh, we're all out of here short. Right? I have to think so. And I also want to say, I think that there is a sense in which, because I grew up in some of that, especially when I was fairly young, there is a sense in which people don't want to live through a world that's hard. They don't want to live through a world of suffering, and they certainly don't want to believe if Jesus is coming back, he might ask you to stick around. Right? It's like, hey, it's going to get bad. And then you're like, and then you're supposed to say, Jesus, and so come with me before it gets bad. But he doesn't. Like, hey, it's going to get bad. Sorry for your luck. No, he doesn't actually say that either. But it's kind of like that. It's like, stick it out, because that's the beginning. Like, I'm not there. I'm not in the earthquake. And that's what he's saying. So I think some of it is like wanting to tell people everything's going to be okay. That it's not going to be hard, and that you're going to be saved out of it, and you're not going to have that punishment. But the reality is that if we get into that mindset again, we tend to retreat. We tend to not get involved with our neighbors. We tend not to invest in our community. And I think you can really see that since the rise of this in like the late 40s. So think about that, like the 50s and the 60s being a time when this hadn't caught fire quite yet, and it really catches fire hard from there. Notice the change in our culture. The idea that, like, well, again, I praise Toledo for this because we've actually have it. It's beautiful. We invest in our town because we're here to stay versus temporary. And then you start to hoard and you start to keep things to your own community. You don't share out. You don't try to build anything for the unbeliever, right? It's all, it becomes kind of, I hate to say it this way, forgive me, but like a Jim Jones type of deal, right? We're all going to get on a camp and we're going to get really private and we're going to have our own private worship service until Jesus gets here. But you can't get that way if you believe that's just the beginning of birth pains, because that means we're going to need to get out there and bind some wounds and fight some pestilences and give food to the people who are dying in famines.
I was counting on the rapture.
Right. And there's no rapture in the Bible. That's, I mean, we could talk about that sometime if you'd like, and we could talk about where they get it, and we could do that. But that's not what it says. Actually, we're going to see this in a minute. One of the rapture verses actually is in here. But it's just not about that. Okay, so where were we here? Okay, so verse 9. Do we still have? Yeah, we still have 5 minutes. Verse 9. Then they will deliver you up. Oh, we already read it. Up to tribulation and kill you and be hated by all nations for my name's sake. They'll be offended. There'll be betrayals. False prophets will come. People will stop wanting to believe in the gospel. The gospel will be preached to the end of the world, and then the end will come. Paul says in his book of Colossians 1:23, quote, the gospel has been preached to every creature. By their own time, they believe that had been fulfilled. Here's the point. That is a prophecy, if you read that, that is of the apostles. That's of the apostles. They're going to go around, and they're going to preach, and they're going to be betrayed, and they're going to be killed. They're going to be beaten, and all of this stuff. But the gospel is going out to the whole world. Okay? And that's what happened. And then it says, and then the end will come. So in other words, you're going to go out and preach to the world, and then the end that we're talking about, this first end, is going to happen. That's going to be the real key. So what does that tell us? Even if we wanted to talk about end times in this passage, that's not what he's talking about, but we said there's kind of a double fulfillment. What are we supposed to be doing as Christians until the end of the time? Until the end of time, being persecuted, being killed, preaching the gospel. That's the sign of the end of time. That's the only sign he gave us. Everything else he says is the beginning, or it's not even part of it. The sign is you're going to go out and they're all going to hate you. like no preacher's going to get rich on TV telling people that. Yeah, go out there. They're all going to hate you. And then people that like you, they're going to betray you. And then people aren't even going to believe the gospel. Their hearts are going to grow cold. Go get them, Tiger. Right? Yeah, not good televangelism, but very accurate statement about the end of this era. So let's continue to go on. Here's how we know it's the end of this era. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake those days will be shortened. Then if someone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from east and flashes to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered also. Okay? So I know this is heavy stuff here. It's sounding pretty end timesy. But the abomination of desolation being in the holy place signals that people in Judea should flee to the mountains. Now, this should be a real clear thing. Those are both geographical statements. The holy place would be the temple, which has not been rebuilt for 2,000 years. Okay? But it was torn down one time, which is what Jesus said he was talking about in the first place. Are you with me? Does everybody kind of follow? They said, hey, when are these stones going to be thrown down? And then Jesus, not answering their question at all, started talking about the end time. No. Hey, Jesus, when are these stones going to be torn down? Oh, let me tell you. And he's telling them. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then if you're living in Judea, which is the southern part of what we call the country of Israel, get out. Okay? So, why? Well, the abomination of desolation is actually a reference to Daniel 9, I believe. Where are my notes here? To Daniel 9. Yeah, 9:27. When this happened previously. So Daniel prophesied that there would be a pagan king. He would come and stand in the holy place. This would desecrate the temple. And then specifically, he offered a pig on the altar, which would have been, as you know, an unclean animal. So that's the abomination of desolation. So when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, that's your sign. He's saying something like the Daniel prophecy. When you see that happen, get out. Well, that is what happened. The Romans come in, and the first place they want to go is the temple to show that the gods have no power. He says, when you see that, you leave. You've got days, and that's exactly what happened. The people had to leave immediately because Rome had this policy, especially with a town like Jerusalem. You couldn't take Jerusalem by military force because it sat on a hill, and in every direction was a precipice. So you can't attack it except for one way, which means no matter how big your army is, it all gets in a bottleneck. And it just becomes a shooting match of just taking out your front line for however long it takes. So Rome developed this really great strategy. Stand way back, cut off all the water, cut off all the food. Right, we do this now. Right? Cut off everything coming into the town. And they'll leave themselves. And then you murder them all while they leave. And that's exactly what they did. So they poisoned the water going into the town, usually dumping dead animals into the streams that fuel the water inside the city, and then wait. So Jesus is saying, don't wait. Like the minute you see, and it's really interesting, this phrase, wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. Eagles don't gather for carcasses. You know that, right? Eagles kill living animals. They don't eat dead animals. But eagles are the signs on the Romans' flags. So when you see those flags take up post, you get. This is your last chance. And that's usually what Rome would say. Anybody innocent? Get out. Because it's on. And it was. That's how they actually took it. So Jesus' warning is exactly what they needed to hear. They needed to hear, it's over for Jerusalem. What if Jesus hadn't said this prophecy? The danger for the Christians who don't hear this prophecy, if Jesus hadn't shared it, is they might have been expecting God to show up. God won't let his temple get destroyed. God wouldn't let this happen. This would happen in the Old Testament. Jesus is being very clear. I have left there. I'm not coming back, and I will not defend it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. Then, and we won't have time because I think I've already gone over 2 minutes. But you'll notice the next section says immediately after the tribulation of those days. So we're still talking temporally about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not until we get to the verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, that it starts talking about the end times. Remember, there were 2 questions. What will be the signs that of these things and of your coming and the end of things? He answers both questions. Here's the signs of these things, the temple never standing, and here is the fulfillment of the end times, and we'll get to that eventually. And we'll also find out there's apparently not much of a sign. Life is going to go on and on and on. the way it always has in history, and then all of a sudden God will say, done.
So if we think about the temple scenario.
Yeah.
Would you apply that currently to say that no temples now would be standing, or churches or worship
Oh.
places?
Sure, that's kind of how the church has interpreted it in the long range, is that over the course of history, Paul mentions this in his own epistles, that in the end there will be so little faith in the world, right? Jesus also mentions it, if you remember. He says, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? So there's this idea that, like, as we go, we're going to get colder and colder toward Christ, and the world will produce fewer and fewer saints, and faith will dry up. Saint Sophrony, a modern saint, made the comment that the earth will end when no divine liturgy is being served on it that day.
It's really sad, dark.
Mm-hmm.
And so people say to me, I mean, I would get it kind of frequently as a priest. It's like, oh, you've seen the news. You see, do you think we're at the end? I say sometimes that we might be the end of something. Maybe something more like what they're experiencing, the end of an era, which will have the same signs. Like, we as Christians don't have to like look at this passage and say, well, it's only about 70 AD. We can say, no, it's about the fall of Rome, right? It's about the fall of any empire that stood, for Christ or whatever, or actually for anybody. So these patterns recur because that's how God works, right? But I always tell people I don't really actually think we're close to that, because the one thing that we have that's interesting about our own time is that within the 20th century, we have had some of the greatest saints the church has ever known from the standpoint of miracles and the standpoint of faith and the standpoint of spreading the gospel. We also have had some major what we might call in America revivals in the church in our day. Like, we're living at the fall of communism. With the fall of communism, our faith has exploded all over the world because it beat the communists. And we were the victims of all the communists, the major communists in the Russia and Romania and all those Eastern European and non-European countries. So, no, I really don't. I don't think we're anywhere near the last divine liturgy being served. If anything, we're watching the faith have another rebirth, in our time. St. John of Kronstadt, who died at the beginning of the 1900s, I mean, St. Seraphim of Sarov, right, before him, these guys aren't small saints. If you read a book about them, you'd think, oh, this guy must have been like right after Jesus. And they're not. They're like in our time. St. John, the prayers of St. John of Kronstadt in Russia led to essentially the revival of Mount Athos. Through his prayers. It's because of him that St. Silouan becomes a monk on Mount Athos. And it's through St. Silouan that much of the faith came to us and to Britain. I mean, no, I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still kicking. We've just got to start taking our faith seriously. We're living at a time that many people would wish they could live in, spiritually. And watch our churches. I was just talking to a guy at a church our size, 15 catechumens they've got. We've got 8. Father Larry just wrote me. He says, what are you doing for your catechumens? We're exploding over here. It's like, that's where we're at, guys. The world is being reached for Christ, and people are flocking into the churches. This is it doesn't look good, I know, on the news, because the world and its processes are failing. That's true. The world's ideas are kind of hitting the end of their gas tank here, but we're not. Just keep going. We're pretty good at this, by the way. We Christians, we've been through this before. Rome fell, we kept going. Right? Jerusalem fell, we kept going. Rome fell, we kept going. Yeah. Let's pray.
O Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all people, light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit,